The white lights of the hospital reflected the coldness of a fate that could no longer be changed. For months, she had cried out for help, showing clear signs that something was wrong. But he, enveloped in his arrogance and blinded by his own pride, had ignored every plea. In that silent room, lying on the bed, her frail breathing was a reflection of the silent struggle she had waged alone. Beside the bed, her young son, unable to grasp the full gravity of the situation, only wept softly, as if his innocence could sense the pain his mother tried to hide. The businessman, accustomed to dominating meetings and deciding destinies with a simple stroke of a pen, now trembled as he held the diagnosis in his hands. Each cold word of the report was a sentence weighing heavily on his shoulders, but none more devastating than the realization that he had ignored the pleas of the man who had given him everything. For the first time, he was not the imposing CEO, not the husband who believed he had absolute power, but simply a broken man, faced with the consequences of his own negligence. The tears he had so desperately avoided finally flowed, and his knees, which had never touched the ground in front of anyone, gave way under the weight of regret. The room became the scene of an emotional collapse that no amount of fortune could repair. She lay silent, no longer needing to say anything. The emptiness between them spoke louder than any words. And, faced with that irreversible moment, the question arises that echoes like a blow. What is the point of having conquered the entire world if in the end the only person who could offer you forgiveness no longer had the strength to respond? If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so that more people can also feel the power of this story. Before life led her to that cold bed in Seoul, Hye-jin had been a young woman marked by the simplicity and tenderness of her homeland. Born in Jeonju, a city known for its traditional hanok houses and an atmosphere where time seemed to slow down, she grew up surrounded by the aroma of freshly cooked rice and the sound of bicycle bells echoing through the narrow streets. Her childhood was not wealthy, but it was rich in affection. She learned early on to appreciate every act of care, to share what little she had, and to smile even when life presented her with challenges greater than her own stature. In her youth, Hye-jin was recognized by everyone as someone with a rare sweetness. She studied diligently, worked odd jobs to help her widowed mother, and even when tired, found time to prepare meals that warmed her neighbors on harsh winter days. She was the epitome of quiet dedication, of those women who didn't need public recognition because her satisfaction came from seeing others prosper around her. When she met Ji-hoon, still an ambitious young man dreaming of becoming a leader in the financial market, she believed she had found someone who, like her, wanted to build a solid family based on love and perseverance. The first years of their marriage were simple, but filled with complicity. She worked tirelessly, taking care of the house, supporting her husband's studies, and giving up her own dreams to ensure his would come true. Even when money was scarce, her faith in the future sustained them. Hye-jin was proud of every accomplishment they achieved together, no matter how small. She fondly remembered the nights they shared a simple bowl of ramen, smiling and believing that one day they would sit at a table laden with food earned through mutual effort. Her love for Ji-hoon was genuine, so strong that it blinded her to the first signs of change in his behavior as success began to approach. It was this woman, shaped by humility and silent sacrifice, who now faced a cruel fate. It wasn't just her body, weakened by illness, that weighed her down, but also her heart, crushed by the indifference of the man she had once called her companion. And, ironically, the more her fragility became evident, the clearer the strength that had always existed within her. What Ji-hoon didn't realize was that as he climbed the ladder of wealth and power, something inside him was being lost with every step, and this arrogant transformation was about to reveal itself. As the years passed, Ji-hoon's ambition became a tangible reality. The young man who had once shared a simple bowl of ramen with Hye-jin now wore impeccably tailored suits, frequented Gangnam's luxurious skyscrapers, and circulated in environments where the gleam of crystal glasses reflected the prestige he had earned. His business boomed, and newspapers touted him as one of Seoul's most promising executives. Soon, the modesty that once seemed to inhabit his essence was replaced by an attitude of superiority, almost as if he had forgotten where he came from and who had been by his side through every difficult moment. As his fortune grew, so did the looks of covetousness and admiration. He was invited to elegant dinners, surrounded by influential businessmen, renowned artists, and high society figures. And it was in these settings that Ji-hoon began to feel ashamed of Hye-jin's simplicity, as if her presence contrasted inconveniently with the sophisticated setting in which he now moved. She, who had always been a source of pride, became an uncomfortable reminder of the humble life he was trying to erase from his memory. It was also during this period that a new figure entered his life. The elegant Soo-yeon, a woman who knew the codes of the elite, mastered the art of seduction, and knew how to manipulate the vanity of a man on the rise. She offered exactly what Ji-hoon longed to hear: praise for his genius, whispers of admiration, and the promise that he deserved much more than he had. With each encounter, her influence grew, and little by little, Ji-hoon distanced himself from the wife who waited at home with hot meals and a ever-patient gaze. For Ji-hoon, public recognition and Soo-yeon's dazzling company began to outweigh Hye-jin's silent fidelity. Love gave way to social calculation, tenderness to the desire for status. And, intoxicated by power, he failed to notice that the brilliance of his professional life was beginning to dim the flame of his personal life. While the city celebrated her achievements, at home the atmosphere grew colder by the day. Words of affection were rare, gestures of contempt multiplied, and the distance between them seemed irreparable. Hye-jin, even though she noticed the change, remained silent, believing it might just be a phase. But Ji-hoon's arrogant gaze made it clear that the woman who had once been everything now seemed almost nothing to him. However, what began as veiled contempt would soon turn into open humiliation, and the following moments would leave scars that not even time could erase. Over time, what had once been merely a look of disdain began to morph into painfully explicit attitudes. Ji-hoon, intoxicated by the prominent position he had achieved, made no attempt to hide his contempt. At corporate parties, where Gangnam's ballrooms were lit by crystal chandeliers and cameras competed for images of celebrities and business people, Hye-jin was frequently placed in embarrassing situations. While the wives of other executives paraded around in sophisticated gowns, she remained in a discreet corner, wearing simple outfits that, while elegant in their own way, were the subject of silent comparisons. Ji-hoon, instead of defending her, seemed to take pride in relegating her to the background, as if her presence were merely an annoying detail amidst the spectacle of power. There was one night in particular that stuck in her memory. At a lavish reception, Hye-jin was forced by her husband to serve wine to the guests as if she were a maid and not the host's wife. The blush on her face betrayed her embarrassment, but she maintained her posture, hiding her shame behind a restrained smile. Each glass she handed felt like a blow to her dignity, and Ji-hoon, indifferent, laughed at Soo-yeon's jokes, displaying her like a trophy before the watchful eyes of high society. It wasn't just public events that revealed her husband's coldness. Inside the home, the atmosphere was equally suffocating. Conversations became dry monologues, where he criticized her for her simplicity, insinuated that she wasn't up to her new status, and sometimes even compared her directly to his mistress. Hye-jin, silent, absorbed each word like an invisible wound. Her voice, once full of affection, fell silent in the face of the indifference surrounding her. Even in the most intimate moments, the distance was insurmountable. Ji-hoon would spend hours away, returning late at night with the scent of another woman lingering on his clothes, and not even bothering to hide it. The home that should have been a refuge became a cold place, where silence weighed more heavily than any argument. And yet, Hye-jin remained, providing for the household, caring for their son, and carrying in her eyes a deep sadness that few could decipher. It was as if her every gesture, every attempt at closeness was deliberately ignored. Hye-jin watched silently, like someone who no longer expects answers, but who records in her soul every detail, every wound left by her husband's contempt. Her strength lay not in fighting back, but in resisting. Deep down, she knew that her silence, sooner or later, would carry a weight Ji-hoon would be unable to bear. What Ji-hoon couldn't foresee was that this apparent submission hid the beginning of a painful but inevitable path, which would culminate in a breakup capable of changing their lives forever. The breaking point didn't come slowly or gradually, but as a sudden, precise, and merciless blow. It was a rainy morning in Seoul, and the sound of raindrops hitting the glass windows of the luxury apartment contrasted with the tension permeating the room. Ji-hoon, sitting in his leather armchair, held a cup of coffee without even looking at his wife. Hye-jin, next to him, remained silent, trying to summon the courage to talk about the medical tests that revealed the severity of her condition. But before she could speak, he coldly interrupted her, saying he didn't want to hear any more complaints, that he was tired of her weaknesses, and that he could no longer bear to live with someone who, according to him, played the victim for attention. The words, hurled like sharp blades, cut deeply. Hye-jin's heart silently broke, but her firm gaze demonstrated that she would not beg. Then, to compound the cruelty, Ji-hoon threw a stack of prepared documents onto the table. The divorce papers. He declared without hesitation that he had made his final decision, that he wanted to move forward with someone who, in his words, would truly represent him in society. The shock was devastating, but what hurt most was not the decision itself, but the indifference with which he communicated it, as if it were just another administrative hurdle to be overcome. Hye-jin tried to argue, not for herself, but for her son. She reminded him of Min-jun, of the nights he cried for his father's presence, of the scars that abandonment would leave on his soul at such a young age. Ji-hoon, however, remained implacable. He said he would provide everything so the child would lack nothing materially, but that he no longer desired his company. For him, family life had become a burden that prevented him from reaching even higher heights. In that moment, Hye-jin's world collapsed. She not only lost the man she had once believed to be her partner, but she was also expelled from the life she had helped build with such sacrifice. She left home with only a small suitcase, taking with her her son's clothes and a few objects of sentimental value. She took nothing but the bare essentials, knowing that nothing material could replace the dignity she still possessed. Min-jun, confused, held his mother's hand as they left behind the home that no longer belonged to them. Hye-jin walked with firm steps, even though her heart bled silently. The boy's cries were muffled by the sound of the rain, but his pain echoed in every beat of his mother's heart. Ji-hoon remained at the door, watching them go, believing he had won another battle, that he had finally freed himself from the weight that bound him to his humble past. What he didn't know was that on that day, Hye-jin had lost almost everything except the dignity she carried with her, silent and intact. And it would be this same dignity that, in the future, would become her most powerful weapon against the arrogance he displayed. For while he believed he had freed himself, she began in silence to live a journey of pain and loneliness that would reveal strengths that not even he would be able to imagine. The first few days after the breakup felt like a plunge into a bottomless abyss. Hye-jin, accustomed to living in a spacious and comfortable apartment, found herself in a small rented room on the outskirts of Mapo, where the peeling walls and the window barely blocking out the cold Korean winter seemed to reflect the fragility of her new life. The space was cramped, barely big enough for a simple bed and a small closet, but for her and her son, it became a quiet refuge from the pain of abandonment. The nights were the cruelest. While Min-jun slept, clutching the teddy bear that still smelled of his old home, Hye-jin lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling and feeling the tears flow uncontrollably. She thought about every detail of the past, every smile that now seemed a distant memory, every sacrifice that had dissolved in the face of Ji-hoon's arrogance. The silence weighed more heavily than any cruel word her husband had ever spoken, because in that solitude she no longer had anyone to share her pain with. Even weakened by the relentlessly advancing disease, Hye-jin refused to play the victim. When her strength allowed, she prepared small meals, tidied his room carefully, and tried to smile at her son, so that Min-jun would believe everything would be okay. She didn't want the child to carry the burden of abandonment, much less the disease that was already consuming her. Thus, her motherly love became a shield against adversity, even though her weakened body could barely support its own weight. There were days when the pain seemed unbearable, when the persistent coughing cut through the early morning silence and her body weakened to the point of near fainting. Even so, Hye-jin would get up, take a deep breath, and keep going, because she knew Min-jun needed her. And that need gave her a purpose that not even Ji-hoon, with all his coldness, had been able to take away. However, behind the calm she displayed toward her son, she hid a devastating internal struggle. Fear for the future, uncertainty about her health, and the feeling of being dismissed as insignificant gnawed at her insides. Yet there was something different in her eyes, a quiet determination born precisely from suffering. Hye-jin was beginning to understand that she could no longer expect anything from Ji-hoon, and that her survival would depend solely on her own courage. And it was in this silence of pain and resistance that the seed of an unexpected turnaround germinated, something that no one, not even Ji-hoon, would have been able to anticipate. It was amidst the solitude of her days that Hye-jin began, almost imperceptibly, to rebuild her own life. There were no grandiose promises, no plans laid out in lavish paper. Her turning point was born in silence, in simple, discreet gestures that carried more power than any speech. Knowing that her health was worsening with each passing week, she began visiting a small community clinic in Hongdae, where she would undergo tests in secret without anyone knowing. Her visits were always discreet, the results kept in envelopes that remained untouched at the bottom of her bag, like secrets she wasn't yet ready to reveal. At the same time, she sought ways to support her son without relying on the pity of others. She began preparing traditional Korean sweets, yakgwa and teok, and selling them at small neighborhood markets. Every coin she earned was carefully saved, not for its value alone, but as a symbol of her own independence. These sales didn't change the financial course of her life, but they represented her courage to keep going, even when her body was crying out for rest. In the afternoons, when Min-jun was at school, Hye-jin would take advantage of the time to study in silence. She borrowed books from community libraries, read articles on entrepreneurship, and even jotted notes in worn notebooks, believing that somehow she could offer her son a different future. It was as if each page she read was an act of resistance against the cruelty of fate. Meanwhile, Ji-hoon believed she had disappeared, that her silence was confirmation of his defeat. For him, Hye-jin no longer existed, replaced by the brilliance of his lover and the social appearances that fed his ego. Yet, with each silent step, she built a new version of herself, stronger, more resilient, and further removed from the shadow he had left. Hye-jin didn't seek open revenge, nor did she expect recognition. Her goal was simply to live with dignity, protect her son, and find some meaning in her remaining days. However, what she didn't realize was that this silent, almost invisible movement was paving the way for an inevitable reunion with the past she was trying to leave behind. For while she quietly worked on her survival, Ji-hoon's empire began to crack, and the first sign of his downfall was about to reveal itself. While Hye-jin silently gathered strength through small acts of courage, Ji-hoon's life, which had once seemed solid as steel, began to crumble into invisible cracks. The financial empire he had so boasted faced an unexpected crisis, the result of hasty decisions and risky partnerships with foreign investors who were now backing away from market instability. Meetings that had once been held in rooms filled with applause now turned into tense discussions, with suspicious glances and reports revealing mounting losses. For the first time in years, Ji-hoon felt the ground beneath his feet was no longer so firm. On a personal level, the situation was no less turbulent. Soo-yeon, who for months had played the role of the perfect lover, began to show her true colors. Her interest in Ji-hoon was less tied to feelings and more to the comfort and status he provided. When the first signs of crisis appeared, she didn't hesitate to express her frustration. Venomous comments crept into small talk, subtle criticisms about the way he conducted business, or how he no longer gave her gifts as often as before. With each sharp word, Ji-hoon realized that the spell binding him to their relationship was more fragile than he had imagined. But the most painful blow came from where he least expected it, from his own son. Min-jun, who still saw his father sporadically due to the formal meetings required by the divorce proceedings, began to reject his father figure. With each visit, the boy demonstrated more resistance, refusing to accompany him on outings or accept expensive gifts that Ji-hoon tried to impose as substitutes for affection. During one of these meetings, the boy said quietly but firmly that he preferred to stay by his mother's side because, unlike him, she was always there, even in moments of pain. These words pierced Ji-hoon like a silent arrow, revealing a wound that not all the power in the world could heal. Between disastrous reports, a lover who was pulling away, and a son who was rejecting him, Ji-hoon felt for the first time that control was slipping away. The man who had once believed himself invincible now found himself facing a reality he couldn't manipulate with contracts or figures. Still, his pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge that part of his downfall was linked to the cruel choices he'd made against Hye-jin. He preferred to blame the market, his partners, and even fate itself, without admitting that the seeds of his downfall had been sown the day he spurned the only person who had truly offered him genuine love. Little did he know that the cracks were just the beginning, and that the reunion with the past, in the form of Hye-jin, would be the definitive blow capable of changing the course of his life forever. Months passed, and Hye-jin's absence from Ji-hoon's social life seemed at first a relief for the CEO's bruised ego. However, fate, in its silent irony, had in store for him a reunion he could never have imagined. The setting was no longer the luxurious ballroom of a hotel, nor the corridors of his company in Gangnam, but the austere atmosphere of a Seoul courthouse where the divorce would finally have its final hearing. Ji-hoon entered confidently, with the same proud bearing as always, surrounded by lawyers and the gleaming presence of Soo-yeon, who accompanied him as if she were the rightful lady of his life. He believed this would be just another bureaucratic step to rid himself of a burden he already considered over. It was then that Hye-jin appeared before everyone. She wasn't the same dejected woman he'd left behind months earlier, crying in a cramped room and carrying only a small suitcase. She entered with firm steps, wearing sober yet elegant clothes that emphasized her serene demeanor. Her face, though still marked by the fragility of illness, radiated a quiet strength that filled the entire room. Her eyes, once filled with unshed tears, now reflected an almost disconcerting calm, as if nothing in that space could shake the dignity that emanated from her presence. The impact was immediate. Murmurs ran through the room, and even Soo-yeon, accustomed to shining with her ostentatious beauty, momentarily lost her air of superiority. Ji-hoon, surprised, took a few seconds to recognize her in this new version, and when he finally did, he felt an unease he couldn't explain. There was no hatred in Hye-jin's eyes, nor any desire for revenge, only an implacable serenity that seemed to weigh more heavily than any accusation. As the lawyers exchanged arguments, Hye-jin stood her ground without raising her voice, without dramatizing. She simply presented documents revealing her medical condition, reports detailing the severity of the disease progressing within her body, which, until that moment, Ji-hoon had insisted on ignoring. The silence that fell after the reading was deafening. For the first time, everyone present realized that the dispute wasn't just about material possessions or custody, but about something much deeper. The stark truth of the life Ji-hoon had destroyed with his own hands. Hye-jin's serenity contrasted with her ex-husband's growing unease. Accustomed to controlling situations, he felt helpless in the face of this silent force. He realized that the woman he thought he had eliminated from his life had returned, not as a victim, but as someone who, even on the brink of the abyss, had chosen to face it head-on. And it was in that same courtroom, before watchful eyes and his own conscience, that Ji-hoon received the most devastating blow of his existence. The revelation that the final sentence would not only be about the divorce, but about the life he could never get back. The courtroom was plunged into a heavy silence, as if every breath were measured and every glance carried the weight of an invisible judgment. Ji-hoon, accustomed to dominating scenes with his commanding presence, felt his hands tremble subtly under the dark wooden table for the first time. The judge handed him a sealed envelope, and that simple gesture seemed to contain much more than ordinary paperwork. It held the truth he had refused to face. As his lawyers whispered instructions and Soo-yeon tried to maintain a confident expression, Ji-hoon broke the seal and removed the documents. His eyes scanned the cold lines of the medical report, and with each word, a deeper shadow crept across his face. Terminal stage, limited days left to live, urgent need for transplant. The letters, harsh and merciless, echoed in his mind like hammer blows, dismantling every shred of his arrogance. He slowly raised his gaze to Hye-jin. There she sat serenely, without tears, without pleas, just with the firm posture of someone who had already accepted her fate. There was no accusation in her eyes, nor any rancor. There was only the truth of someone who no longer needed words to prove anything. Ji-hoon felt his heart tighten, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, as if the weight of all his choices had fallen on his shoulders all at once. The biggest shock, however, came on the last page of the report. Lee Ji-hoon was the only donor compatible with saving the life of the woman he had abandoned and humiliated. In that moment, the world stopped. The air seemed thin, and the voices around him became a distant murmur. For the first time in his impeccable career, there was no strategy, no contract, no figure capable of altering that fate. It was him or no one. Soo-yeon, sensing the impact, backed away discreetly, like someone already planning their own escape from a story they didn't want to be a part of. The lawyers tried to hide their embarrassment, but the tension was evident. Ji-hoon, unable to contain himself, let the papers slip from his hands and fell to his knees before Hye-jin. The unexpected scene provoked a collective murmur in the courtroom. The man who had always prided himself on never bowing to anyone now begged for forgiveness before the wife he had so despised. His tear-filled eyes met hers, and his voice choked, repeated words he would never have spoken before. "Forgive me. Please forgive me." Every syllable carried not only regret, but also despair, as if he understood he was begging not just for her salvation, but for his own redemption. Tears streamed down his face, tarnishing the image of an unshakable man he had always cultivated. Hye-jin, however, didn't respond. She remained serene, looking straight ahead, as if she no longer needed to hear belated apologies. Her strength lay not in fighting back, but in remaining unwavering in the face of the one who had hurt her. Ji-hoon, desperate, reached out his hands, but found only emptiness. And in that emptiness, he realized that forgiveness isn't something you buy, nor something you demand. It's something you earn, and he had lost that chance forever. The courtroom dissolved into an even deeper silence. The judge, cautiously, adjourned the session. But the true sentence had already been handed down, not in the official papers, but in the invisible weight crushing Ji-hoon from within. He wasn't just a man facing the collapse of his marriage. He was a human being, confronted with the collapse of his soul. But the most devastating blow was yet to come, for Hye-jin's decision would not be pronounced in words, but in a silence so piercing that it would destroy Ji-hoon's heart once and for all. The courtroom was nearly empty. The seats, which minutes before had been filled with onlookers, lawyers, and journalists, were now occupied only by the distant echo of hurried footsteps and the murmur of the last hushed conversations. But for those who witnessed the scene, the image etched in their memory was not of papers being gathered or files being closed, but rather of a once feared man, now on his knees, begging for the attention of the woman he had once mercilessly humiliated. Ji-hoon trembled. His hands, clasped together in supplication, held nothing but his own despair. His gaze, which had once held arrogance and pride, now begged for a shred of compassion. He seemed to believe that perhaps a single gesture from her could rescue him from the abyss into which he had plunged. But before him was no longer the submissive woman who silently accepted the wounds of her soul. Hye-jin remained in absolute silence, so serene that her posture was more cutting than any words could be. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath. It was as if she had gathered in a single breath all the years of pain, all the sleepless nights, all the humiliations she had swallowed. When she opened them, there was no anger in her expression, but neither was there tenderness, only the firmness of someone who had finally understood that her struggle was over. Beside her, Min-jun held her hand tightly. He was just a child, but the tension in the room made him realize something important was happening. The boy wasn't crying, but his shallow breathing and wide eyes showed he was absorbing every detail of the scene. Hye-jin leaned in gently, ran her hand through her son's hair and whispered softly, almost like a secret, "Take good care of what's left." The simple, short sentence struck Ji-hoon like an irrevocable sentence. He looked up with a stunned expression, not immediately comprehending the depth of those words. Only later, feeling the silence that followed, did he understand that it wasn't a plea for his care, but a declaration that his presence no longer had a place in that circle of affection. The room remained silent. No sound, no protest, no movement of pity. There were no fiery accusations, no cries of outrage. Hye-jin didn't need any more of this. Her final choice was the absolute refusal to offer any response. It wasn't revenge, but the conscious decision that he no longer deserved even her words, and it was precisely this absence that destroyed him. Ji-hoon realized, with brutal clarity, that he would not receive the chance to defend himself, nor the relief of a discussion, nor even the opportunity to justify the mistakes he had. Always believed he could cover up with power and money. His punishment would come not from judges, laws, or lawyers, but from the indifference of those who had once been his victims and now moved on without looking back. The weight of this realization crushed him. For the first time, the man who ruled companies, who made employees tremble in his presence, was faced with someone who didn't bow, who didn't waver, who needed nothing from him. Hye-jin rose in dignity with each passing second, and he sank further into ruin. He reached out again, as if he could touch her, stop her, bring back what she'd lost. But Hye-jin simply turned her face serenely, brushing it off with the ease of someone saying goodbye, not just to a person, but to a lifetime of pain. With firm steps, she stood up, took Min-jun's hand, and headed for the door. The soft click of her heels echoed through the empty hall like a final sentence, each step resonating inside Ji-hoon like hammer blows that sealed his fate. He tried to stand, but his knees felt heavy. The world seemed to spin, and for the first time he understood what it meant to be ripped from his position of power and faced with the stark reality. He was alone. Outside, the journalists' flashbulbs waited, eager to capture images, but Hye-jin didn't care. For the first time in years, there was no fear, no shame, no humiliation. She emerged not as a victim, but as a survivor. And every curious glance or invasive question was nothing more than a distant noise in the face of the certainty that her freedom no longer depended on anyone's approval. As she walked out, Ji-hoon stood there, his eyes fixed on the closed door. He felt that, along with that dry sound of wood meeting the frame, his entire life had ended. There was no going back. The following days became an even greater torment. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the scene repeat itself. Her ignoring him, walking with her head held high, carrying with her the son who would never proudly call him father. The newspapers reported her downfall, some extolling her courage, others exploiting the spectacle of her humiliation. But nothing was as cruel as the silent judgment of her own conscience. For Hye-jin, however, the chapter was closed. She didn't allow herself to waste energy on hatred or revenge. Her victory wasn't in seeing him destroyed, but in knowing that despite everything, he still had the strength to rebuild. Her final choice was not to cling to the past, but to hold her son's hand firmly and walk toward a future where dignity would not be negotiated. Ji-hoon, for his part, discovered that indifference can be more devastating than any court ruling, because deep down there was nothing more painful than realizing there was no longer room for him, not even as a worthy memory. And so, in that courtroom, their story didn't end with screams, tears, or promises. It ended with silence, a silence that not only destroyed the man kneeling on the floor, but also definitively liberated the woman who had learned that her greatest weapon would always be the choice not to bow down again. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. The man who believed he dominated everything was defeated not by a planned revenge, but by a woman's simple refusal to spend her last strength on him. The days following the trial were silent, but charged with a symbolism impossible to ignore. Hye-jin, already weakened by the relentlessly advancing disease, found peace in the small gestures she could still offer her son. In the small, simple house she had returned to, the atmosphere was filled with the warmth of genuine love, far more precious than any luxury she had ever had. She spent her afternoons holding Min-jun's hand, reading stories softly and etching memories into his heart that would become eternal. There were no complaints, no regrets in her demeanor, only the serenity of someone who understood that life was not about accumulating possessions, but about loving sincerely and unconditionally. Meanwhile, Ji-hoon wandered alone through the cold corridors of an apartment that no longer brought him satisfaction. The marble walls, artificial lights, and deathly silence surrounded him as if they were living proof of his defeat. He tried to work, tried to immerse himself in contracts, but the papers that once represented power now felt like empty sheets of paper, incapable of filling the void in his soul. The echo of Hye-jin's footsteps as she left him at the courthouse replayed in his mind every night, reminding him that the greatest wealth he had ever possessed had slipped through his fingers. Time had become cruel to him. His lover disappeared without a trace, taking with her only what mattered to her, status and convenience. His once sycophantic partners recoiled from his strategic failures, and the newspapers that once celebrated his success now published rumors about his career's decline. Ji-hoon remained alone, facing the reality he had created with his own choices. The man who had never bowed to anyone now found himself crushed by the weight of his own arrogance. Meanwhile, in her final days, Hye-jin found solace in watching Min-jun grow up surrounded by love. She didn't desire revenge, she didn't desire applause. Her triumph lay in the fact that despite all the pain, she had preserved her dignity until the end. Her passing would not be remembered as that of a defeated woman, but as that of someone who, even in the face of injustice and humiliation, chose to remain true. That was true victory. And thus poetic justice was served. She departed, leaving a legacy of love and courage, while Ji-hoon remained imprisoned by guilt, condemned to forever carry the burden of his choices. He didn't need to be destroyed by anyone. It was his own arrogance that led to his ruin. In the contrast between Hye-jin's peace and his loneliness, fate showed that no earthly power can overcome the truth of the human heart. In the end, it wasn't illness that defeated Hye-jin, but the indifference of those who were supposed to love her. And paradoxically, it wasn't wealth that secured Ji-hoon's victory, but the guilt that imprisoned him forever. Life, in its silent irony, has shown that those who spurn sincere love inevitably end up stripped of everything they believed they possessed. If you were moved by this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video. Here, each story is crafted to touch your soul and spark reflections that will stay with you forever. Your next story begins with the next click.